Section 7, Europe and the Faith, by Hilaire Belloc. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Europe and the Faith, by Hilaire Belloc. Section 7, Chapter 2, What was the Church in the Roman Empire? So far, I have attempted to answer the question, what was the Roman Empire? We have seen that it was an institution of such and such a character, but to this we had to add that it was an institution affected from its origin, and at last permeated by another institution. This other institution had, and has, for its name, the Catholic Church. My next task must therefore be an attempt to answer the question, what was the Church in the Roman Empire? For that I have not yet touched. In order to answer this question, we shall do well to put ourselves in the place of a man living in a particular period, from whose standpoint the nature of the connection between the Church and the Empire can best be observed. And that standpoint in time is the generation which lived through the close of the 2nd century and on into the latter half of the 3rd century, say from AD 190 to AD 270. It is the first moment in which we can perceive the Church as a developed organism now apparent to all. If we take an earlier date, we find ourselves in a world where the growing Church was still but slightly known and by most people unheard of. We can get no earlier view of it as part of the society around it. It is from about this time also that many documents survive. I shall show that the appearance of the Church at this time, from 150 to 240 years after the crucifixion, is ample evidence of her original constitution. A man born shortly after the reign of Marcus Aurelius, living through the violent civil wars that succeeded the peace of the Antonines, surviving to witness the Decian persecution of the Church, and in extreme old age to perceive the promise, though not the establishment, of an untrammeled Catholicism. It had yet to pass through the last and most terrible of the persecutions, would have been able to answer our question well. He would have lived at the turn of the tide, a witness to the emergence, apparent to all society, of the Catholic Church. Let us suppose him the head of a senatorial family in some great provincial town, such as Lyons. He would then find himself one of a comparatively small class of very wealthy men to whom was confined the municipal government of the city. Beneath him he would be accustomed to a large class of citizens, free men but not senatorial. Beneath these again his society reposed upon a very large body of slaves. In what proportion these three classes of society would have been found in a town like Lyons in the 2nd century, we have no exact documents to tell us, but we may infer from what we know of that society that the majority would certainly have been of the servile class, free men less numerous, while senators were certainly a very small body. They were the great landowners of the neighborhood. And we must add to these three main divisions two other classes which complicate our view of that society. The first was that of the freed men. The second was made up of perpetual tenants, nominally free, but economically and already, partly in legal theory, bound to the wealthier classes. The freed men had risen from the servile class by the sole act of their masters. They were bound to these masters very strongly, so far as social atmosphere went, and to no small extent in legal theory as well. This preponderance of a small wealthy class we must not look upon as a stationary phenomena. It was increasing. In another half-dozen generations it was destined to form the outstanding feature of all imperial society. In the 4th and 5th centuries, when the Roman Empire became from pagan Christian, the mark of the world was the possession of nearly all its soil and capital, apart from public land, by one small body of immensely wealthy men, the product of the pagan empire. It is next important to remember that such a man as we are conceiving would never have regarded the legal distinctions between slave and free as a line of cleavage between different kinds of men. It was a social arrangement and no more. Most of the slaves were indeed still chattel, bought and sold. Many of them were incapable of any true family life. But there was nothing uncommon in a slave being treated as a friend, in his being a member of the liberal professions, in his acting as a tutor, as an administrator of his master's fortune, or a doctor. Certain official things he could not be. He could not hold any public office, of course. He could never plead, and he could not be a soldier. This last point is essential, because the Roman Empire, though it required no large armed force in comparison with the total numbers of its vast population, for it was not a system of mere repression, no such system has ever endured, yet could only draw that armed force from a restricted portion of the population. In the absence of foreign adventure or civil wars, the armies were mainly used as frontier police. Yet, small as they were, it was not easy to obtain the recruitment required. The wealthy citizen we are considering would have been expected to find a certain number of recruits for the service of the army. He found them among his bound free tenants and enfranchised slaves. He was increasingly reluctant to find them, and they were increasingly reluctant to serve. Later recruitment was found more and more from the barbarians outside the empire, and we shall see on a subsequent page how this affected the transition from the ancient world to that of the Dark Ages. Let us imagine such a man going through the streets of Lyons of a morning to attend a meeting of the Curia. He would salute and be saluted as he passed by many men of the various classes I have described. Some, though slaves, he would greet familiarly. Others, though nominally free and belonging to his own following or accompanied, it may be presumed, by a small retinue, some of whom might be freedmen of his own, some slaves, some of the tenant class, some in legal theory quite independent of him, and yet by the economic necessities of the moment practically his dependents. As he passed through the streets, he notes the temples dedicated to a variety of services. No creed dominated the city. Even the local gods were now but a confused memory. A religious ritual of the official type was to greet him upon his entry into the assembly. But in the public life of the city, no fixed philosophy, no general faith appeared. Among the many buildings so dedicated, two perhaps would have struck his attention. The one, the great and showy synagogue, where the local Jews met upon their Sabbath, and the other a small Christian church. The first of these he would look on as one looks today upon the mark of an alien colony in some great modern city. He knew it to be the symbol of a small, reserved, unsympathetic but wealthy race scattered throughout the empire. The empire had trouble with it in the past, but that trouble was long forgotten. The little colonies of Jews had become negotiators, highly separate from their fellow citizens, already unpopular, but nothing more. With the Christian Church it would be otherwise. He would know, as an administrator, we will suppose him a pagan, that this church was endowed, that it was possessed of property more or less legally guaranteed, it had a very definite position of its own among the congregations and corporations of the city, peculiar and yet well secured. He would further know it as an administrator, and this would more concern him, for the possession of property by so important a body would seem natural enough. That to this building, and the corporation of which it was a symbol, were attached an appreciable number of his fellow citizens, a small minority, of course, in any town of such a date, the first generation of the 3rd century, but a minority most appreciable and most worthy of his concern from three very definite characteristics. In the first place, it was certainly growing. In the second place, it was certainly, even after so many generations of growth, a phenomenon perpetually novel. In the third place, and this was the capital point, it represented a true political organism, the only subsidiary organism which had risen within the general body of the empire. If the reader will retain no other one of the points I am making in this description, let him retain this point. It is from the historical point of view the explanation of all that was to follow. The Catholic Church in Lyons would have been for that senator a distinct organism, with its own officers, its own peculiar spirit, its own type of vitality which, if he were a wise man, he would know was certain to endure and to grow, and which, even if he were but a superficial and unintelligent spectator, he would recognize as unique. Like a sort of little state, the Catholic Church included all classes and kinds of men, and like the empire itself within which it was growing, it regarded all classes of its own members as subject to it with its own sphere. The senator, the tenant, the freedman, the slave, the soldier, in so far as they were members of this corporation, were equally bound to certain observances. Did they neglect these observances, the corporation would expel them or subject them to penalties of its own. He knew that though misunderstandings and fables existed with regard to this body, there was no social class in which its members had not propagated a knowledge of its customs. He knew, and it would disturb him to know, that its organization, though in no way admitted by law and purely what we should call voluntary, was strictly very formidable. Here in Lyons, as elsewhere, it was under a monarchical head called by the Greek name of the Episkopos. Greek was a language which the cultured knew and used throughout the western or Latin part of the empire to which he belonged. The title would not therefore seem to him alien any more than would be the Greek title of presbyter, the name of the official priests acting under this monarchical head of the organization, or than would the Greek title diakonos, which title was attached to an order just below the priests, which was comprised of the inferior officials of the clerical body. He knew that this particular cult, like the innumerable others that were represented by the various sacred buildings of the city, had its mysteries, its solemn ritual, and so forth, in which these, the officials of its body, might alone engage, and which the mass of the local Christians, for such was their popular name, attended as a congregation. But he would further know that this scheme of worship differed wholly from any other of the many observances around it by a certain fixity of definition. The Catholic Church was not an opinion, nor a fashion, nor a philosophy. It was not a theory, nor a habit. It was a clearly delineated body, corporate, based on numerous exact doctrines, extreme jealousy of its unity and of its precise definitions, and filled as it was with no other body of men at that time with passionate conviction. By this I do not mean that the senator, so walking to his official duties, could not have recalled from among his own friends more than one who was attached to the Christian body in a negligent sort of way, perhaps by the influence of his wife, perhaps by a tradition inherited from his father. He would guess, and justly guess, that this rapidly growing body counted very many members who were indifferent, and some perhaps who were ignorant of its full doctrine. But the body as a whole, in its general spirit, and especially in the disciplined organization of its hierarchy, did differ from everything round it in this double character of precision and conviction. There was no certitude left, and no definite spirit or mental aim, no dogma, as we should say today, taken for granted in the Lyons of his time, save among the Christians. The pagan masses were attached without definite religion to a number of customs. In social morals they were guided by certain institutions, at the foundation of which were the Roman ideas of property in men, land and goods. Patriotism, the bond of smaller societies, had long ago merged in the conception of a universal empire. This Christian Church alone represented a complete theory of life, to which men were attached as they had hundreds of years before been attached to their local city, with its local gods and intense corporate local life. Without any doubt, the presence of that church and of what it stood for would have concerned our senator. It was no longer negligible, nor a thing to be only occasionally observed. It was a permanent force, and what is more, a state within the state. The end of section 7.